The Civil War in the United States by Karl Marx. Articles from the New York Daily Tribune, 1861 to 1862. Number 4. The Intervention in Mexico. London, November 8, 1861. The contemplated intervention in Mexico by England, France, and Spain is, in my opinion, one of the most monstrous enterprises ever chronicled in the annals of international history. It is a contrivance of the true Palmerston make, astounding the uninitiated by an insanity of purpose and imbecility of the means employed, which appear quite incompatible with the known capacity of that old schemer. It is probable that, among the many irons which, to amuse the French public, Louis Bonaparte is compelled to always keep in the fire, a Mexican expedition may have figured. It is sure that Spain, whose never overstrong head has been quite turned by her recent cheap successes in Morocco and St. Domingo, dreams of restoration in Mexico, but nevertheless, it is certain that the French plan was far from being matured, and that both France and Spain strove hard against a joint expedition to Mexico under English leadership. On September 24th, Palmerston's private moniteur, the London Morning Post, first announced in detail the scheme for the joint intervention according to the terms of a treaty just concluded, as it said, between England, France, and Spain. This statement had hardly crossed the Channel when the French government, through the columns of the Paris Patrie, gave it the direct lie. On September 27th, the London Times, Palmerston's national organ, first broke its silence on the scheme in a leader contradicting, but not quoting, the Patrie. The Times even stated that Earl Russell had communicated to the French government the resolution arrived at on the part of England of interfering in Mexico, and that Monsieur de Thouvenel replied that the Emperor of the French had come to a similar conclusion. Now it was the turn of Spain. A semi-official paper of Madrid, while affirming Spain's intention to meddle with Mexico, repudiated at the same time the idea of a joint intervention with England. The Demetis were not yet exhausted. The Times had categorically asserted that the full assent of the American president had been given to the expedition. All the American papers taking notice of the Times article have long since contradicted its assertion. It is therefore certain, and has even been expressly admitted by the Times, that the joint intervention in its present form is of English, i.e., Palmerstonian, make. Spain was cowed into adherence by the pressure of France, and France was brought round by concessions made to her in the field of European policy. In this respect, it is a significant coincidence that the Times of November 6th, in the very number in which it announces the conclusion at Paris of a convention for the joint interference in Mexico, simultaneously published the leader pooh-poohing and treating with exquisite contumely the protest of Switzerland against the recent invasion of her territory, viz., the Dappenthal, by a French military force. In return for his fellowship in the Mexican expedition, Louis Bonaparte had obtained carte blanche for his contemplated encroachments on Switzerland and, perhaps, on other parts of the European continent. The transactions on these points between England and France have lasted throughout the whole of the months of September and October. There exists in England no people desirous of an intervention in Mexico save the Mexican bondholders, who, however, had never to boast the least sway over the national mind. Hence the difficulty of breaking to the public the Palmerstonian scheme. The next best means was to bewilder the British elephant by contradictory statements, proceeding from the same laboratory, compounded of the same materials, but varying in the doses administered to the animal. The Morning Post, in its print of September 24th, announced there would be, quote, no territorial war in Mexico, that the only point at issue was the monetary claims on the Mexican exchequer. that, quote, it would be impossible to deal with Mexico as an organized and established government, and that consequently, quote, the principal Mexican ports would be temporarily occupied and their customs revenues sequestered. The Times of September 27th declared, on the contrary, that, quote, to dishonesty, to repudiation, to the legal and irredeemable plunder of our countrymen by the default of a bankrupt community, we were steeled by long endurance, and that consequently, quote, the private robbery of the English bondholders lay, not as the Morning Post had it, at the bottom of the intervention, while remarking en passant that, quote, the city of Mexico was sufficiently healthy should it be necessary to penetrate so far. The Times hoped, however, that, quote, the mere presence of a combined squadron in the Gulf and the seizure of certain ports will urge the Mexican government to new exertions in keeping the peace and will convince the malcontents that they must confine themselves to some form of opposition more constitutional than brigandage. If, then, according to the Morning Post, the expedition was to start because there, quote, exists no government in Mexico, it was, according to the Times, only intended as encouraging and supporting the existing Mexican government. To be sure, the oddest means ever hit upon for the consolidation of a government consists in the seizure of its territory and the sequestration of its revenue. The Times and the Morning Post, having given out the clue, John Bull was then handed over to the minor ministerial articles, systematically belaboring him in the same contradictory style for 4 weeks, until public opinion had at least become sufficiently trained to the idea of a joint intervention in Mexico, although kept in deliberate ignorance of the aim and purpose of that intervention. At last, the transactions with France had drawn to an end. The Moniteur announced that the convention between the three interfering powers had been concluded on October 31st, and the Journal des Débats, one of whose co-proprietors is appointed to the command of one of the vessels of the French squadron, informed the world that no permanent territorial conquest was intended, that Veracruz and other points on the coast were to be seized, an advance to the capital being agreed upon, in case of noncompliance by the constituted authorities in Mexico with the demands of the intervention. That, moreover, a strong government was to be imported into the Republic. The Times, which ever since its first announcement on September 27th seemed to have forgotten the very existence of Mexico, had now again to step forward. Everybody ignorant of its connection with Palmerston and the original introduction in its columns of his scheme would be induced to consider the today's leader of the Times as the most cutting and merciless satire on the whole adventure. It starts out by stating that, quote, the expedition is a very remarkable one. Later on it says a curious one. 3 states are combining to coerce a fourth into good behavior, not so much by way of war as by authoritative interference on behalf of order. Authoritative interference on behalf of order. This is literally the Holy Alliance slang, and sounds very remarkable indeed on the part of England, glorying in the non-intervention principle. And why is, quote, the way of war and of declaration of war and all other behests of international law supplanted by, quote, an authoritative interference in behalf of order? Because, says the Times, there, quote, exists no government in Mexico. And what is the professed aim of the expedition? Quote, to address demands to the constituted authorities at Mexico. The only grievances complained of by the intervening powers, the only causes which might give to their hostile procedure the slightest shade of justification, are easily to be summed up. They are the monetary claims of the bondholders and the series of personal outrages said to have been committed upon subjects of England, France, and Spain. These were also the reasons of the intervention as originally put forth by the Morning Post, and as some time ago officially endorsed by Lord John Russell in an interview with some representatives of the Mexican bondholders in England. Today's Times states, England, France, and Spain have concerted an expedition to bring Mexico to the performance of her specific engagements and to give protection to the subjects of the respective crowns. However, in the progress of its article, the Time veers round and exclaims, "We shall no doubt succeed in obtaining at least a recognition of our pecuniary claims. In fact, a single British frigate could have obtained that amount of satisfaction at any moment. We may trust, too, that the more scandalous of the outrages committed will be expiated by a more immediate and substantial atonements. But it is clear that, if only this much was to be brought about, we need not have resorted to such extremities as are now proposed." The Times, then, confesses in so many words that the reasons originally given out for the expedition are shallow pretext, that for the attainment of redress nothing like the present procedure was needed, and that, in point of fact, the quote, "recognition of monetary claims and the protection of European subjects have nothing at all to do with the present joint intervention in Mexico." What, then, is its real aim and purpose? Before following the Times and its further explanations, we will, en passant, note some more curiosities which it has taken good care not to touch upon. In the first instance, it is a real curiosity to see Spain out of all other countries, turn crusader for the sanctity of foreign debts. Last Sunday's Courrier de Dimanche already summons the French government to improve the opportunity and compels Spain, quote, "into the eternally delayed performance of her old standing engagements to French bondholders." The second still greater curiosity is that the very same Palmerston who, according to Lord John Russell's recent declaration, is about invading Mexico to make its government pay the English bondholders, has himself voluntarily, and despite the Mexican government, sacrificed the treaty rights of England and the security mortgaged by Mexico to her British creditors. By the treaty concluded with England in 1826, Mexico became bound to not allow the establishment of slavery in any of the territories constituting her then empire. By another clause of the same treaty, she tendered England, as a security for the loans obtained from British capitalists, the mortgage of 45 million acres of the public lands in Texas. It was Palmerston who, 10 or 12 years later, interfered as the mediator for Texas against Mexico. In the treaty then concluded by him with Texas, he sacrificed not only the anti-slavery clause, but also the mortgage on the public lands, thus robbing the English bondholders of the security. The Mexican government protested at the time, but meanwhile, later on Secretary John C. Calhoun could permit himself the jest of informing the Cabinet of St. James that its desire, quote, "of seeing slavery abolished in Texas would be best realized by annexing Texas to the United States." The English bondholders lost, in fact, any claim upon Mexico by the voluntary sacrifice on the part of Palmerston of the mortgage secured to them in the Treaty of 1826. But, since the London Times avows that the present intervention has nothing to do either with monetary claims or with personal outrages, what then, in all the world, is its real or pretended aim? An authoritative interference on behalf of order. England, France, and Spain, planning a new Holy Alliance, and having formed themselves into an armed Areopagus for the restoration of order all over the world. Mexico, says the Times, must be rescued from anarchy and put in the way of self-government and peace. A strong and stable government must be established there by the invaders, and that government is to be extracted from, quote, "some Mexican party." Now, does anyone imagine that Palmerston and his mouthpiece, the Times, really consider the joint intervention as a means to the professed end, viz., the extinction of anarchy and the establishment in Mexico of a strong and stable government? So far from cherishing any such chimerical creed, the Times states expressly in its first leader of September 27th, quote, The only point on which there may possibly be a difference between ourselves and our allies regards the government of the Republic. England will be content to see it remains in the hands of the Liberal Party, which is now in power, while France and Spain are suspected of a partiality for the ecclesiastical rule which has recently been overthrown. It would indeed be strange if France were, in both the Old and the New World, to make herself the protector of priests and bandits. In today's leader, the Times goes on reasoning in the same strain and resumes its scruples in the sentence. Quote, "It is hard to suppose that the intervening powers could all concur in the absolute preference of either of the two parties between which Mexico is divided, and equally hard to imagine that a compromise would be found practicable between enemies so determined." Palmerston and the Times, then, are fully aware that there exists a government in Mexico, that the Liberal Party, ostensibly favored by England, is now in power, that ecclesiastical rule has been overthrown, that Spanish intervention was the last forlorn hope of priests and bandits, and finally, that the Mexican anarchy was dying away. They know, then, that the joint intervention, with no other avowed end save the rescue of Mexico from anarchy, will produce just the opposite effect: weaken the constitutional government, strengthen the priestly party by a supply of French and Spanish bayonets, rekindle the embers of civil war, and instead of extinguishing, restore anarchy to its bloom. The inference the Times itself draws from these premises is really remarkable and curious. Although, it says, the considerations may induce us to look with some anxiety to the results of the expedition, they do not militate against the expediency of the expedition itself. It does, consequently, not militate against the expediency of the expedition itself, that the expedition militates against the only ostensible purpose. It does not militate against the means that it baffles its own avowed end. The greatest curiosity pointed out by the Times I have, however, still kept in petto. If, says it, President Lincoln would accept the invitation, which is provided for by the convention, to participate in the approaching operations, the character of the work would become more curious still. It would indeed be the greatest curiosity of all if the United States, living in amity with Mexico, should associate with the European order mongers, and by participating in their acts, sanction the interference of a European armed Areopagi with the internal affairs of American states. The first scheme of such a transplantation of the Holy Alliance to the other side of the Atlantic was, at the time of the Restoration, drawn up for the French and Spanish Bourbons by Chateaubriand. The attempt was baffled by an English minister, Mr. Canning, and an American president, Mr. Monroe. The present convulsion in the United States appeared to Palmerston an opportune moment for taking up the old project in a modified form. Since the United States, for the present, must allow no foreign complication to interfere with their war for the Union, all they can do is to protest. Their best well-wishers in Europe hope that they will protest, and thus, before the eyes of the world, firmly repudiate any complicity in one of the most nefarious schemes. This military expedition of Palmerston's, carried out by a coalition with two other European powers, is stating during the prorogation, without the sanction and against the will of the British Parliament. The first extra-parliamentary war of Palmerston's was the Afghan War, softened and justified by the production of forged papers. Another war of that kind was his Persian War of 1857 to 1858. He defended it at that time with a plea that, quote, "the principle of the previous sanction of the House did not apply to Asiatic wars. It seems that neither does it apply to American wars. With the control of the foreign wars, Parliament will lose all control over the national exchequer, and parliamentary government turn to a mere farce." New York Daily Tribune, November 23, 1861. You have reached the end of the fourth article in the series, The Civil War in the United States by Karl Marx. Click on the links at the end of the video to go to the playlist or the next article if it's available. If you enjoy this content and would like to support the channel, please like and subscribe.